Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin Wiedmann. I'm a professor at Cornell University and co-director of the New York State Integrated Food Safety Center of Excellence. And I'll introduce these centers in the next slides, but these are CDC-funded centers that work on helping train individuals at state health departments and public health individuals throughout the U.S.
It just cancels itself out.
What was that? Did someone say they cannot hear me?
I'm gonna go ahead and mute everyone, so you may have to unmute yourself, Martin, after I do that, just in case somebody forgot to do that when they entered the room.
All right. Can you hear me okay, or is that, or?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay. All right, unmuted myself again. So what we will bring to you today is a webinar on interviewing food workers in an outbreak investigation as part of an environmental assessment. And this is really part one in an effort to develop training materials on interviewing food workers as part of environmental assessments. So we will use the webinar today, which we will record, make available, to also develop quick train videos that people can use to prepare themselves for environmental assessments and specifically for the interview part of environmental assessments. I want to thank David, Nicholas, and Alexa for helping me put the slides together. And David should be online, so I will every now and then just open up the line for him to add comments, because he's really the one who has more experience than I have in doing these environmental assessments. The Integrated Food Safety Centers of Excellence are funded by the CDC. These are 5 centers. They are funded under the Food Safety Modernization Act. And the goal of these centers is really to provide training related to food safety programs for public health agencies. So state health departments, local health departments, et cetera. We do this through a variety of different mechanisms, and webinars like this are one of them. If you want to know more about the Integrated Food Safety Centers of Excellence, it's a simple search for them, and you can identify some of what these programs do. You can identify some of the tools we have developed, and I'll hint on some of them, such as quick train videos that are relevant to environmental assessments, etc. And you can also identify contact people at these centers that may help you if you have suggestions for other trainings or needs for other trainings that you would see. The New York Center specifically is a collaboration between Cornell University and the New York State Department of Health. One of the unique aspects about these integrated food safety centers is that all of them are a collaboration with a state health department and an academic partner, or sometimes multiple academic partners. You can see here in more detail the different centers. So Washington, Colorado, Minnesota, Tennessee, and New York. And we each have a group of states that we sort of work with, but that obviously does not mean you could not reach out to a center in another state. So even if you're not in the New York region, the region covered by the New York COE, and you have questions after this webinar, definitely reach out to us. But if you have general questions and just wondering who your initial entry point is, I would suggest you start with the COE that is part of your group of states. So for those of you familiar with environmental assessments, there obviously is a very in-depth environmental assessment training. There are EATS series. I think there's EATS 101 and EATS 102, which are longer trainings that really cover all parts of environmental investigations and environmental assessments. In contrast, this webinar is really intended to very much focus on the interview process of this procedure, and to be shorter. So this will be something that someone who's done the EATS training could watch, for example, just to prepare themselves as they go on an environmental assessment. If they need a refresher, or maybe someone needs to do an environmental assessment and needs to do an interview and they don't have time to do the whole EAT series, this is what this is intended for, but it's not intended to replace that type of in-depth training. So here's what we're going to go through today. So let's start out with a brief review of what environmental assessments are. According to NEARS, an environmental assessment is a systems-based component of an outbreak investigation that describes how the environment contributed to introduction or transmission of these organisms that cause or could cause illness. And because it is an outbreak, you know, it means cause illnesses. When we talk about environment, that's everything outside the host: air, food, water, animals, etc., etc. These environmental assessments can be conducted at every point along the farm to fork continuum. So that could be a produce farm, it could be a packing house, but most of my comments and most of the things we cover today will be if it's at restaurants or retail establishments that serve foods. But a lot of the ideas, a lot of the thoughts that I will outline today would apply to other situations too, if you were to do an environmental assessment there. The important thing here is this is a component of an outbreak investigation, and I will emphasize this over and over again. This is not an inspection. This is, we have an outbreak, we have people that are sick, and we're trying to investigate what caused this outbreak. And we're using interviewing people as a key component to it. This is not, we go on an inspection into a facility that is where there's no evidence that they are responsible for an issue such as an outbreak. This is important because often the same people that do inspections also do these environmental assessments. So it's important to get people to understand that difference and almost go in with a very different mindset. It's more of a detective mindset, finding the source when you do an environmental assessment. Environmental assessment and environmental investigations are two terms that are sometimes used interchangeably. I usually gonna say environmental assessment a little bit narrow. It's a part of an environmental investigation. The investigation will include sample collections, such as even stool samples, environmental sponge samples, food samples. In general, that would be an environmental investigation. The assessment is really where you go in and interview people and watch a facility. But that's maybe a little bit of a semantic, so we're not going to stick with that so much. I want to mention here that the COE has trainings for some of these other components of an environmental investigation. There are stool sampling training videos. There are webinars and quick trains on environmental sampling. If you suspect salmonella, if you suspect listeria, how do you collect samples? So if you're interested in some of these other parts of an environmental investigation, you know, there are training materials available. If you can't find them, contact us and we make sure you find the right training materials. The objectives of an environmental assessment are to identify contributing factors, identify environmental antecedents, which sometimes called root causes, and then use that information to generate recommendations for interventions. Sometimes that's at the specific facility that is part of that environmental assessment. Sometimes this could be more broadly. It could be for all restaurants that are part of a chain, or it could be for an industry at large. So this one, you know, small corner restaurant could have huge implications for recommending recommendations for a whole chain. So we have to keep this in mind. These are really, really important because they can be the foundation for some major changes that are made in these establishments that will reduce the risk of future foodborne illnesses. Contributing factors versus environmental antecedents. Often this causes some confusion, consternation, particularly in people who have not lived in this world. Contributing factors are factors that introduce or otherwise permit contamination, proliferation, so growth, or survival of pathogens. There's a list of contributing factors, a NEARS list, so one very common one might be improper hot holding or improper cooling. The important thing is some of these sound very similar to violations that would go on an inspection report, but they're not. They are different, and we'll emphasize it. So again, people who do this should not go in the inspection mentality. This is a different procedure. Environmental antecedents are conditions that lead to the contamination, survival, or increase. And it's the reason why these contributing factors occur. So for example, improper hot holding to the malfunctioning equipment. The real question is, why do we have malfunctioning equipment? We don't have processes in place to make sure our equipment functions properly. We don't monitor temperature routinely. These are what I would often call root causes. These are important because if we eliminate those, we're not just going to eliminate the one problem that led to the outbreak, but we broadly reduce food safety risks. That's why we collect them. That's why we report them in years, so that we can make changes that reduce foodborne illness risks. Let's talk a little bit about more on environmental antecedents. Often they can be grouped into different categories, everything from people to equipment to process, foods, and economics. And often, you know, the economics is really can be the underlying, you know, we might have the antecedent might be people, and it might be the lack of a sick leave or paid sick leave. But the reason why we don't have a paid sick leave is really economics. So we need to consider that very often the environmental antecedent at least includes a component of economics. Even if we have equipment that is not easily cleanable, equipment that is old and not properly working. Why do we have that equipment? Economics, okay? So often that becomes one of the environmental antecedents. Here's an example of an outbreak and how we apply these principles. So you say you have a cooler that stored the implicated foods, and that cooler is at 57 degrees Fahrenheit, obviously temperature abuse. The contributing factor is that the reaching cooler is overstocked. It's impeding airflow, so the temperature can't be reached. Why do we have that? It's an insufficient capacity of the equipment. Why do we not have enough equipment? Economic considerations could play one role in this, for example. Or it could be simply our planning procedures for how do we plan out how much equipment we need. This affect this one cooler that might affect other things that could equipment. So a couple examples. One of them is a norovirus example, obviously a common issue in outbreaks in restaurant or food service facilities. This one, suspected food item was a deli platter, the sandwiches. When we go in, we interview food workers. We were able to actually find 2 workers that reported illness the day these sandwiches were prepared. The interview also showed that these people used bare hands. These individuals used bare hands. When they were asked why they went to work sick and why they did not wear gloves, you know, no paid sick time, and no supply of gloves. So it's opposed to them leading to sort of an economics as an underlying theme. And on top of it, the 2 workers were found to be positive, you know, for norovirus. So contributing factors, bare hand contact, environmental antecedents, people, and economics. So another example is a Campylobacter example. This is much more of a typical cross-contamination issue. Here, the suspect food would be a garden salad. Environmental assessment included a food prep review. When that salad prep was reviewed, it turns out that the person preparing the salad is using a single cutting board for cutting salad and preparing chicken for grilling. Obviously, we all cringe when we hear this. And so cross-contamination issue here. When asked about training and food safety practices, you know, no training provided, too expensive to have someone come in, too expensive to send people out. You know, we hear these excuses regularly. So again, very realistic example. So contributing factor, cross-contamination, environmental antecedents, processes, economics, and in this case, equipment, because again, we only had a single cutting board. So, you know, insufficient funding to have sufficient appropriate equipment will come up as an environmental antecedent over and over again. So when we talk about an environmental investigation overall, what are the different steps? Planning and preparation are essential. If you think you will collect samples, you need to coordinate with the laboratory. Training videos on that provide more details. Often a lab will only want you to collect 5 samples, when in reality you know that you're going to need to collect 20 or 30 sponge samples. You need to make sure you have the right supplies. You also need to pre-plan, understand, etc. Then there's the actual site visit. You try to sort of assess the facility maybe as undisturbed as you can, and we get into that a little bit more, before you do interviews with management and interviews with employees. And once you've done this, you may do environmental sampling. It obviously depends on the pathogen. And then, wrap up the sampling and verify that you collected your samples correctly, packaged them correctly, and then get samples delivered to the laboratory. We're going to focus most of it on 1 and 2 for the rest of this presentation. So getting into the mindset, and I think this is again, you will hear me say this at least a few times, this is not an inspection, this is an environmental assessment, and we need to get into that mindset. It's important to understand that, food service, restaurants contribute a significant amount to foodborne illnesses in the US. Some estimates, and I consider them very soft, suggest that 50% or maybe even more of foodborne illness outbreaks in the US are associated with restaurant, delis, and other facilities. If we do these environmental assessments right, we will contribute to reducing foodborne illnesses costs through these venues. And this is a significant issue because, our estimate is something around 50 million cases of foodborne illness a year in the US. Why is an environmental assessment so important and useful? It is there to identify the source of an outbreak so that we can implement control measures to prevent future outbreaks, and not just outbreaks, but also reduce the risk of individual cases where it's just one person getting sick at one restaurant and where we don't really, know that they even occur as an individual case linked to a person, but they do occur. And if we prevent and control factors that contribute to outbreaks, we will also reduce the risk of sporadic foodborne illness cases. And the implications can be, as I said, there can be a single facility. We just simply get a facility to do a better job at hand washing or at training. Can have a much larger impact that we have changes that is implicated, that is, or training that is required, etc. All of these things can happen if we, for example, show that lack of training is a particularly important cause of these outbreaks. But we need to have data, we need to have numbers to prove that, because as many of you know, if we change a regulation, we need to assess the economic impact and the benefits. We can't just go in and require by regulations for businesses to do something if we cannot show that it will have a benefit. These environmental assessments, they might seem mundane in some cases, but that's what provides the data that allows governments, state or federal, to change regulations and to implement more strict regulations. So again, avoid the inspection mentality. Many environmental antecedents would not be covered by regulations. If you just look for, compliance with regulations, you're not going to find the environmental antecedents. You might have conditions and practices that comply with regulations, but still might be a contributing factor on environmental antecedent. And this is the sort of stuff you're actually looking for, because if you have someone that complies with the regulation, but that facility still, or those practices still a contributing factor, then that probably means we need to change regulation in the long term. These are the types of data we're collecting. So, state ordinance might allow for a maximum temperature of 45 degrees. In a facility, food might be held at 44 degrees. or refrigerator might be set at 44 degrees. It takes too long to cool it, so that temperature could still contribute to an outbreak. So environmental assessment would still say, that temperature contributed to the outbreak, but that would not be a violation of a regulation. I'm going to sort of stop here for a second just to see whether our friends in Rhode Island that sort of suggested this, or David has any sort of additions, comments, anything. Again, I'm not the practical guy who's doing these, so I'm looking for feedback here. And anyone else who wants to chime in, please do so, because it will help us develop better training materials as we go forward and develop these quick train videos. So if you're on a phone, it's *6 to unmute yourself. If you're on Zoom on the computer, you have to hover over Zoom either on the top or bottom. So any questions, comments so far?
So Martin, this is David. I'll just add that you really touched on some very key points, that this is, not an inspection, it is an investigation. That's what we want to focus on. But the other thing that I'd like to bring up is what you also talked about was regarding, we need to collect this data and the importance of collecting this data. So there may be some people on here that might not be familiar with NEARS, the National Environmental Assessment Reporting System, or Mental Health Specialist Network that's part of CDC. Please look into those. You could just do a Google search. But if you're not collecting environmental assessment data using NEARS, you may want to look into that, because this is a great way of collecting this data, interviewing the workers and managers, find out what's really happening, and helping drive regulations across the states.
Great, thank you. Thank you, David. Okay. If there are no other comments, let's move in the interview process. So the first part is preparation for the interview. So before you leave for the interview, you want to at least get some basic information. You want to understand what forms you're going to use, whether there are forms, what you ultimately have to report. If you report into NEARS, which you should be familiar with what sort of parts are required for a NEARS report. You should review the foodborne illness complaints and any available epidemiological information. So that's, when was the first case observed? How many cases were there? Did this outbreak occur over 3 or 4 days? Was it multiple days? Was it people in one area? All that sort of information. What are the implicated food items? What did the case control study or the food interviews reveal as a likely source, etc.? If at all possible, and this might not be an in-person meeting, but it should be at least a phone, epidemiologist, talk to environmental health personnel, even talk to the lab people to discuss this outbreak, that you go into the facility, that you're doing interviews, you're doing an environmental investigation, environmental assessment, to get an idea from them what you might want to focus. Sometimes the lab people can be very helpful, and I'll give you some ideas of why and how that might be. You might identify records that you can gather from the facility before you go in, saying, okay, do you have temperature records, protocols that you can review, just to help you understand. So if you're not sure what you're asking, how do you expect to get a good answer? And get a realistic estimate in terms of the amount of time you will need to do the interview so you can plan properly. Understand the facility you're working with. Is it a fine dining restaurant or fast food? Is it a chain? Look at the file. Maybe try to understand a little bit of the supply chain if you can, but a lot of it depends on the pathogen you're dealing with. If it's a chain, often they have their standardized, highly regulated supply chains where all the suppliers have undergone tremendous supplier verification. On the other hand, some fine dining, smaller institutions, they may use hunter and gatherers. I mean, I've learned this. There are restaurants where there are local people that go out and collect fiddlehead ferns and mushrooms that end up on the menu. Get an idea of what you might be dealing with here before you go in. Know the size of the facility, layout, opening times, etc. Try to get yourself as familiar with the facility as you can before you go in. Understand the pathogen, understand the incubation periods. Those are important in two different ways. If you have a pathogen that has a 24-hour incubation period, and the first case happened on January 23rd, then you say, okay, that's a food that person consumed on January 22nd, maybe 21st. That tells you what dates you need to hone in when you ask questions, such as, okay, did you have anything specifically happening on Monday, January 22nd, or Sunday, January 21st? Do you have more workers out than usual, etc.? So it helps you zone in on that. The other thing what it helps you with is figuring out if you suspect workers, what are we talking about there in terms of incubation periods? When did they acquire disease? Because if it's a disease that is transmitted through workers, such as norovirus, you might want to ask about, okay, when were you sick? Did you get sick? Did you have people in your sick, etc., and then work back from that. Symptoms of the infection is important. Again, particularly important if you're trying to interview food workers, because you want to know what you're asking them if it's a pathogen where the food worker could be a source. Understand whether you're dealing with a pathogen that's likely transmitted by cross-contamination. Is the typical issue undercooking? What other subtyping data do you have on pathogens that might help you find out where to look? So I'm going to give a salmonella example. So salmonella comes in different varieties that we call serotypes. So one of them people might have heard of is enteritidis. Another one people might have heard of is Dublin, maybe less likely, or Newport, or Typhimurium. Salmonella enteritidis is typically associated with poultry. Has to be eggs. Does it mean it has to be poultry? Absolutely not. But you definitely want to make sure you ask some questions around poultry, eggs, practice of cooking or undercooking eggs, cross-contamination from eggs or poultry, because it tells you that those are important questions to ask. On the other hand, Salmonella Dublin would be typical for cattle, so bovine. So if you know your outbreak is linked to Salmonella Dublin, you might want to ask about beef, undercooking beef, etc., because that will be a typical source of Salmonella Dublin. Direct animal contact can play a role with Salmonella Dublin. So that the lab can tell you. It will take you a long time of Google searches to find it out. If you go to a lab saying, hey, what's this pathogen? What other data do we have? Do we have DNA fingerprinting data? Based on your experience with this pathogen, are certain food items, certain things I should be looking at, I should be particularly diligent with asking questions about. Get that information, because it will help you focus your interviews and your investigation when you go in. Here's some just a high level idea about different pathogens. So, Clostridium perfringens, not unusual in food service. Possible causes, typically it's food that's not kept hot enough. This whole idea of the danger zone, that's Clostridium perfringens and Bacillus cereus. That's that zone where Clostridium grow. If it's not cold enough, not hot enough, that middle ground, and that will then lead to toxin production, which will make people sick. Very similar for Bacillus cereus. If you have a Clostridium perfringens issue, I personally would not spend a lot of time interviewing people to see whether we have ill workers, okay? Because perfringens has nothing to do with workers that carry it. Perfringens has nothing to do with cross-contamination. We're gonna zone in and hone in on cooling and heating and keeping foods cold, keeping foods hot, because that's where our issue is. On the other hand, if we have a norovirus outbreak, it's going to be sick workers. It could be undercooked or raw seafood, oysters or mussels. Refrigeration, not an issue. Norovirus doesn't grow. Doesn't matter what temperature you put it at, grow. There's no amplification. So, and it's figuring out all refrigeration temperatures because that's not going to be where your issue lies. Salmonella, there are a lot of things could go wrong. You really have to cover all your bases. It could be cooking, it could be cross-contamination, it could be sick workers, it could be pests, it could be proximity to livestock, it could be ingredients from what I call sketchy suppliers. You know, it's in dry products, it could be in spices, it could be in almost anything. It can even survive in the environment of a kitchen and can be contamination from the environment. So you really need to ask a lot of different questions there. Enterohemorrhagic E. coli, Campylobacter, very similar. You know, undercooking probably more important. Cross-contamination probably more important. Survival in an environment less important than for Salmonella, but in general similar. So those are the things you want to be prepared because it will help you focus what you do and what questions you ask when you go into a facility. You know, again, you don't need to learn this from a textbook. You talk to your lab, you talk to the experts in your organization. They should be able to give you that information. All right, now let's talk about the interview process itself. So typically, an environmental assessment will involve interviewing at least one manager, sometimes managers, plus employees and workers. You try to do this as soon as you can, so what we would call, you know, our first visit. You don't want to do, if you do multiple visits, you know, that you do it on the second or third visits. Why? Because people will forget things. People won't remember whether someone was sick, all of that stuff. So the sooner you get in and interview people, the better off you are. Your department might have policies in interviewing food workers and managers. Make sure you have those, make sure you understand those. Just because I see it in a chat, we had a question about slides. Yes, we will make the slides available. We will make them available as PowerPoint so you can modify them any way you want to. And as Alexa pointed out, we will also post this on YouTube. So how do we conduct the interview? Now let's get a little bit more into nuts and bolts here. Something that might sound very counterintuitive, but David and I kicked it around. Some experienced people tell you, you know, 50% of the interview is actually not the interview. It's that you're there, you're watching people and processes as you stare and interview. You see what happens around you. You listen to people that you're not interviewing. You can gain a lot of information. My favorite story here is I worked in a facility. It was a food safety issue. And I sort of was talking to people, interviewing them, and overheard someone walking up to the front desk to the receptionist and saying, someone's got to go out. We need some Imodium. Now, Imodium, as everyone knows, is a drug that is used to treat diarrhea. You don't need, if you run a food establishment, if you're sending out your receptionist to get Imodium for workers, you have a problem. You have a big problem, okay? No one's going to tell that to you in an interview, but you can gather information. This is obviously a very extreme case, but just listening, being there. Very important information that you can then use in your interview to ask follow-up questions. So if you only focus on the interview and don't realize that it's about watching people, watching things, listening to people, you might not get, and you will not get as much information out of the interview and out of the environmental assessment as you can. When you arrive, you know, you have to introduce yourself to the manager and food workers, explain why you're there, try to remain conversational, try to not make this adversarial because you're much less likely to get good information if you make this adversarial. Body language is key. You know, again, you got to make people feel that you're not adversarial, that you're just trying to get a general information, that you're not trying to blame someone. Often people are afraid that they're going to get blamed in this process. Anything you can do to prevent people thinking that are good. You want to avoid asking leading questions. if you ask, do you keep food out of the refrigerator for extended times, multiple hours, you immediately imply that they're doing something wrong, versus just asking, if you take food out, how long before you have time to put it back is not a leading question. So the more you can stay away from leading questions, the better off you are. The longer you're on interview, the more likely you're going to ask leading question because you think you know what's going on and you just want to have confirmation. Don't do that. Be very cautious about leading questions. You want to do this interview on site, and obviously because otherwise you can't observe. We know during COVID, some of these interviews might have to be online and through a phone, but the better, if you're there, if you can see and observe, if you can see the body language of the people you talk to, the better off you are. Element of surprise can be an advantage. You want to see how the facility operates under normal circumstances. So if you come in, yes, I said you have to introduce yourself, and you do, but maybe just walk around where you can, walk around the outside of the facility, watch people take a smoke break. Just get an idea of the attitude of the facility, the people, what's happening, are people yelling at each other. All of those sort of things can help you and really ask better questions, etc. And then you go introduce yourself and go in. Because that really will help set you up to do a better interview. We're going to talk about two interviews, so the manager interviews and then the worker interviews. Manager interviews, the nearest report form actually asks to at least interview one manager that has responsibilities over the kitchen. The questions you ask there fall into multiple categories. First one is questions about the establishment. Is it an independent establishment or a chain establishment? Is an independent establishment often we worry more about, supply chains, purchases, because there might be less stringent food safety regulations, less attention paid to suppliers. You want to identify when are the busiest day, what's the busiest time of the day, because that's when things are more likely to go wrong. You want to find out whether foods are prepared or partially prepared at a commissary or any other locations. We had Bacillus cereus outbreaks we dealt with, where some of the product, I think it was refried beans, but it might not have been, but for argument's sake, it could have been. They were prepared at a commissary or another location, and there was a Bacillus cereus outbreak. So even a Clostridium perfringens outbreak may not have to occur due to practices at the facility if products that are susceptible to that were prepared at another location and they came with the toxin. Ask question about the kitchen managers, training, communication, breakdown of communication. Poor training is obviously an issue. Language is an issue there. So try to assess language barriers because that could be a problem. Understand what type of food safety training is done. Are people food safety certified? How often do they do their training? Ask question about food workers. Again, what training they do. Look at cleaning policies. So that's particularly important if you're dealing with, cross-contamination. And we talked about it. Know your pathogen when you ask about it. Clostridium perfringens, cleaning isn't going to matter much here. It's all about food temperature. But cleaning policies can be important very important for cross-contamination. Your Campylobacter, your Salmonella. If there were a Listeria outbreak, very, very important. What is clean and sanitized? When is it? Are there written instructions? What is disposable glove usage, etc. And as you get this information, then you can cross-reference then with what you observe, so that it will help you understand whether people actually do what they're supposed to do. Questions about employee health policies, and that's, of course, as we said, particularly important, essential when we deal with norovirus or Hep A, somewhat important for, Salmonella, Campylobacter, E. coli, not really important when we're dealing with Clostridium perfringens or Bacillus cereus. Paid time off, paid sick time is an important one. If you don't have paid sick time, people that need the income, which many people that work in these establishments do, are more likely to come in. Even more subtle things, such as if you get a bonus for perfect attendance record for 8 weeks. You know, that encourages people to not be out when they're sick because they want to get that bonus. Think of that proverbial person that knows they're going to get a $100 bonus because they have 3 months perfect attendance record, and it's that last day before the 3 months is up and they are sick, mild diarrhea. Are they really going to forgo a $200 bonus? Probably not, maybe not. And so that's a more subtle way of economic incentives for people to come in sick. Try to find those. Near's the part 3 instructions, which refer to interviews, specifically talk about some details. You know, should be a manager that is interviewed, has authority over the kitchen and is familiar with operations. Should be a semi-structured interview, so you know, you don't just go with the question. If you find something interesting, you follow up. If you see something you want to follow up on it. Nearest part 3 requires you to provide the length of the interview, so keep track of that. Next, we move on to worker interviews. Try to find out from epidemiology, lab, incubation period, what time frame you're interested in. Is it, you know, January 21 to 24? Do you want to figure out who's there? Try to interview those people if you can. If you're not, you know, see whether you can get access to them. In many cases, particularly if it's norovirus, salmonella, anything where a sick person could be the root cause, make sure you interview multiple workers. Sometimes, let's take the proverbial deli platter. You know, just because employee A prepared the deli platter, don't just interview employee A. Other people might have touched things that went on the deli platter, might have sliced the meat. Interview multiple workers, particularly when you have these foodborne illness outbreaks where a carrier, a sick worker is suspected as a source. Try to stay away from the managers, interview the worker in private. That is very important, because if policy says you don't come to work when you're sick and the person came to work, they're going to be very, very worried about negative repercussions. You need to think how you can create a safe environment where people are not afraid that they're going to get fired if they confess that they went to work sick. That's going to require some, you know, really careful questioning. So sometimes that might be you ask about, has anyone in your family been sick around this time? And then when they say that, then you can ask, have you been sick? And then they might say, well, not really, but very mildly, etc. So there's some roundabout ways to just get an idea whether someone generally in the environment has been sick, to get at that question without saying, hey, did you come to work in violation of your sick policy, which is what it might sound like. So be very careful how you ask questions there. Alexa, I see we have some action on chat, so I'm not going to be able to look at that, but if something is an acute question, just interrupt me, or same for you, David.
I actually, I'm seeing some questions about eats and when it would be available. I actually don't know that, because I tried to access it yesterday as well, and they're not available. I don't know if anyone on CDC knows the timeline about that, but I don't know.
Great. And if any other questions that just acutely refer to a slide, you know, jump in at any time. And David, if you have a slide where you want to add something, jump right in and interrupt me. I do not mind being interrupted. Try to make the worker your friend. You know, it might be overstating it a little bit, but make them feel comfortable. Make them feel comfortable that, you know, their answers will remain confidential. Ask questions similar to what you asked the manager. Find out whether the employees really do what the managers think they're doing. And again, food preparation practices are important. You know, do people come to work sick? What are the policies around that is very, very important. Ask more direct questions about things that are relevant to the investigation. If you know what the food vehicle is, ask about it. Ask about how salad is prepared. Ask about how the deli platter is prepared. Ask them to review the different steps. Maybe even see whether you can watch it. Find out where the ingredients are stored, etc. Find out whether they use gloves, whether they use utensils, when and how often they take the temperature, and whether the thermometers were calibrated, all of those things. And this, again, right, it's important for you to know what the implicated food is. Now, epidemiologists on this webinar are going to hate me for that, but sometimes epidemiology isn't going to be 100% right. You might think it's a deli bladder, but it could have been something else. So ask about other types of foods too. Don't just ask about the food that Epi tells you is the most likely source, because it's the most likely source. It's not a definitive. Talk about equipment. You can talk about it in general terms. Do you have problems with any of your equipment, like your buffet line? You don't even need to ask about temperature. You can ask about general problems. How often do you do maintenance? How often do you need to get stuff fixed? Same thing about coolers. And then indirectly, you're going to get at that question of does it hold temperature? As I said, we can't overemphasize that with many pathogens, particularly norovirus, Hep A, but also Salmonella, it is very important to determine whether workers have been sick. This is where you may need to interview as many workers as possible, not just the ones that prepared the suspect food vehicle, but trying to focus in on the ones that were there at the time or at a logical time of exposure based on incubation period. Probe for symptoms of vomiting and diarrhea, unless for some reason there might be other symptoms. Be very aware of the fear of retaliation, assure them of confidentiality. And depending on your jurisdiction, who you work with, if you identify workers with symptoms, you might take that info, and the infectious disease office might do a more comprehensive interview. We also should not forget that sometimes the sick employee might not be the cause, it might be a consequence, because the employee might have eaten the same food that made others sick. Sometimes that can start a continued chain of transmission. Undercooked chicken, employee eats it, employee gets sick, and then goes to work sick, and then the outbreak continues even when we stop undercooking the chicken, for example. So sometimes it's not just one thing, so keep that in mind too. That's been known. Once you're done with the interview, linger around, try to observe things. Say you go to the bathroom, come back, and just don't look like you're taking notes. Just sort of look like you're disinterested, because it will help you identify what's really happening. Again, just to sort of illustrate, funny story. We had a food processing plant, and there were all these maintenance cards around in that processing plant. They moved all around the facility, and we're like, that's a problem. And then we came back in the afternoon, and suddenly no maintenance cards were there anymore. Well, it turned out FDA came, and as soon as FDA came, all the maintenance cards disappeared. So things will change when someone knows that a regulator is here, or that someone is observing them is here. As they get used to you, they might return, and they should return to their typical practices. So the more you can find some time to stick around, observe, verify that what happened in the interview, what you were told is actually what's happening, the better off you are. You might take temperatures, you might test sanitizing solutions. Just in general, look at those things. Does gloves magically appear? That's sort of very similar to my story about the maintenance card that magically disappears. So things magically appear and disappear if people feel like it's a public health official or a regulatory person comes in. When you observe, look up and down. Don't just look at eye level. Look under a table. Look up and look for evidence of leaks, etc., and other issues. In the refrigerators, everywhere else. Sometimes that's where you find the really relevant things that will get you at root causes. Exit interview. After you're done, sit down with the manager, debrief them, make sure they understand what happened, what you found. Give them resources so they can fix the problem right then and there. So if there's a real problem that you're afraid is going to perpetuate, don't make them wait. Say, here's what I found. This could have caused the outbreak. And then give them an opportunity to come back to you. Interviews as managers and employees are a critical part of an environmental assessment. And an environmental assessment is critical for us to put in place better practices, not just at one facility, not just as one chain, but sometimes it's to be able to change regulations. because we can show the impact. If we find the same, contributing factors, the same environmental antecedents over and over again, we have them recorded. That gives us the power and gives governments the power to change regulations. Without doing this, we're not going to have that. Preparation, understanding what the issue is important to the structure of your interview. If you don't even know, not that anyone here would do this, if you go in and you don't even know whether we're talking about a Clostridium perfringens outbreak or a Salmonella outbreak, or Clostridium perfringens or norovirus, you're going to ask the wrong question and you're going to spend a lot of your time unproductively. Adapt to the settings, be the fly on the wall, try to not antagonize interviewees, try to not make them feel like you're going to try to find blame. Just sort of say, we broadly just trying to connect information. As I said, yes, it's an interview, but the observation that is part of the interview is as important as the interview itself. That's where you often gain relevant information that might be valuable by itself or might be valuable by guiding the questions you ask. That's what I had. I want to open it up maybe first for a few comments from David, if I missed something, if I didn't emphasize something enough, and then open it up to questions. If anything comes up afterwards, feel free to email me or email Alexa or both of us, and we'll follow up with you any way we can. David, anything to add?
Thanks, Martin. I'll just add that I know there's a question about the CDC Eats training. I know CDC has been working on getting that page up, but obviously issues that we all are currently dealing with COVID have changed timelines, but I do know that's still a work in progress. However, some of you out there are in need of training or have questions about conducting environmental assessments, interviewing workers, please reach out to your COEs. There are, as Martin mentioned, the number of COEs across the country that basically have regions, and if you're know the COE in your region, feel free to reach out to them. Each COE has environmental specialists on their team that know how to do environmental assessments and that are there to provide you with guidance and support when you need it. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions regarding that. The other thing I would like to mention is that there was a lot of material in this presentation, and I know the focus was on interviewing workers and managers, but there's more to interviewing than just interviewing. And I think this was a very good display of what actually goes into an interview. You need to know what you're going into before you actually start that interview process. You need to be able to observe what's happening while you're there, not just, interviewing the person with yes, no questions. And then the observation part of it as well is going to tell you whether or not the information you obtained from your interview is actually true, or they're actually practicing what they preach. So that was why we kind of put a big overview into this presentation, so that you get more than just going in there and asking a person questions, because an interview involves a little bit more than just that.
Okay, so I see a couple of questions pop up in the chat. So again, if you want to ask it live, go ahead, *6 to unmute yourself on the phone. If you're on Zoom, hover with your mouse above or below, and a bar will pop up where you just can unmute yourself. One of them is, it appears that you make use of the principles of motivational interviewing. I may do that. I didn't realize it. I got to look into that, but it makes sense from what it sounds like. So whoever made that comment, thank you for the comment, because that's something I'm going to look into. The other one is, it will be interesting in the future to see some role playing to help give examples, such as refocusing interviews that get misdirected. That's exactly the type of feedback we're looking for, and we will be making these quick train videos, and I think those are some of the things we could incorporate there. So again, I want to reemphasize that this is not the end of this. We're going to make some short videos that would help with interviewing, maybe break it up into a few pieces. So if you have any suggestions, what to add, what else we could do, don't hold back. Any other questions, comments, suggestions from anyone? So for those of you not seeing the chat, Best Victory said the EATS training should be available next month, and we will send an email out when it is available again. Any other questions? Sounded like someone unmuted themselves, so don't be shy. No questions make me always make me nervous. If someone wants to make me less nervous, ask a question. Okay, if not, we're 2 minutes before 2. We actually put this landing down pretty accurately. So if no one else has any questions, David, any last comments or anyone else? I want to thank again also Rhode Island Department of Health who suggested this. If any of you have any comments, additions on your observations, I know you wanted to particularly emphasize the importance of interviewing workers. I hope I've done that justice, but if you have any other comments and emphasis areas, that would also be great. Okay, having none, feel free to reach out to, again, Alexa, me personally too, if you have any questions, or David. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.